pleasure to welcome Ernest Wilson back for his second Du Bois lecture. Yesterday's was quite crackling, I think, and I expect today's will be too. I will just introduce Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham, who will introduce Dean Wilson. Evelyn is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of History and Professor of African and African American Studies here at Harvard, and she's the chair of the department. And she is fabulous herself. So welcome her, and thank you for coming.
Well, good afternoon. This is a great pleasure. I am quite honored to introduce our speaker to you today. I always like to say, though, that I met Ernest Wilson many decades ago, but I met him through his wife. Skip likes to tell his story about meeting Chico, as we called him then, in Africa. But I met Fran when both of us were Du Bois Fellows at Harvard. And it was several decades ago. But Fran is still the only roommate that I have ever had. You were, I mean, if I don't count husbands, but Fran, you were my first and only roommate. So I met Chico then. So it's been a long and really great friendship. So it's my great honor to introduce Ernest James Wilson III to you this afternoon for the W.E.B. Du Bois lecture series entitled Exclusion and Inequality in Digital Societies, the Theories, Evidence, and Strategies. Ernest Wilson is the Walter Annenberg Chair in Communication and Dean of the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California. He's also Professor of Political Science and Senior Fellow at the USC Center on Public Diplomacy. His long and illustrious academic career began here at Harvard as an undergraduate, and he left a lasting impression. He was, as Skip so well said yesterday, one of the student activists responsible for founding the Department of African and African American Studies. That was more than 40 years ago, and we are forever in your debt. The department then was called the Department of Afro-American Studies. Ernest Wilson received his MA and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. And prior to going to USC, he served on the faculty of the University of Maryland, College Park, where he was the director of the Center for International Development and Conflict Management, and he was also professor of African American Studies there. Ernest Wilson has long been a leading, indeed eminent figure in the fields of communication and policy. He's moved adroitly in the academic world, the public-private sector, government. He served as a consultant for the United States Information Agency, the White House National Security Council, the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, the United Nations, and the World Bank. He has directed several projects, and one of note, the impact of new information technologies on conflict management and development in Africa. And that was part of an Internet Connectivity in Africa program that was sponsored by the USAID. He has engaged in similar projects for the United Nations Commission on Science and Technology for Development, as well as for the Ford Foundation and the Rockefeller Foundation. He has many honors. In 1983, he was named by the United States Junior Chamber, JCs, as one of the outstanding young men of America. He received the Carter G. Woodson Award in 2009 from Our Authors Study Club. And recently, he was designated by the International Studies Association as Distinguished Scholar in International Communications. In fact, most recently, he was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences for his great contribution to scholarship. He's authored numerous publications. I'll just name a few. He is the editor. He authored first in 2003, The Information Revolution and Developing Countries. In 2004, he was the editor of Diversity and U.S. Foreign Policy. In 2006, he He co-edited with Kelvin Wong, Negotiating the Net, The Politics of Internet Diffusion in Africa. And forthcoming, and we're all looking forward to this, is his co-edited book with William Drake, Governing Global Electronic Networks, which is forthcoming from MIT. In that book, in fact, in 2009 also, he's did a really interesting chapter in a book entitled And Communications for All, a Policy Agenda for the New Administration. And that chapter is called Digital Media, Democracy, and Our Truncated National Debate. So he brings to our attention complex problems in race-based exclusion from true access to information and communication technologies. And this is why we want him to speak to us today. He has been invited to many audiences, and he has himself made us an audience to visit his companion website that he created around these lectures, and that site is www.digitaldubois.net. Well, please join me in welcoming Ernest James Wilson III as he speaks on the topic Policy Responses to Digital Inequality Beyond Economics. Welcome.
Thank you. Ooh, Thank you.
Knock
Thank
you
you.
over.
That's okay.
Great to see you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, I want to thank Evelyn for that really very, very generous introduction. And there are a number of people in the audience who date back to those early days before there was an institute and before there was a department. And I think even in our wildest memory, in our wildest imagination, and thinking back on it, could we have hoped to see the kind of activity and intellectual ferment and policy relevance and just general excitement that I now see at both the Institute and the department. So I really do want to congratulate all of you who have been laboring in the vineyards to bring this about. But I do have to say, these aren't bad vineyards in which to labor. So I want to thank Skip, I want to thank Evelyn, and everyone who was here. I also want to take the opportunity to recognize a Du Bois scholar who has produced a path-breaking work entitled The Segregated Scholar, in which Du Bois figures prominently along with his intellectual descendants. And this is the real Professor Wilson, Dr. France Hill Roussan Wilson, who's sitting in the front row. I'd like to thank her. She's my wife also, after that. And also my very best editor and writing coach is my son, Malik Wilson, who is also here. So I would like to welcome him, who took the train up. I'm going to do a couple things. I'm going to recap a little bit what I said yesterday in that initial lecture, because that initial lecture lays out the intellectual and conceptual framework for the work that I'm going to do today. So yesterday we sort of talked about theories and concepts and definitions of what we mean by a communication society, an information society, etc. Today I will apply that framework to a series of examples. I don't want to call them case studies, but I want to call them examples. And then in the third lecture, tomorrow, what I will do is bring together the implications of those cases developed by the framework and theory to two issues. One is internal to the African-American community, and one is external to the African-American community. So the internal component is, what do all of these new media, these digital media, what impact do they have on internal discussions within the African-American community? Think of the term the public sphere, the black public sphere, and what implication does Twitter and blogging have for the construction and maintenance of the sort of internal dialogue that all groups have? I was recently talking to a friend in China. I was there not too long ago. And they were talking about how do they develop a public sphere that's a political public sphere where they can talk to one another without getting busted by the authorities. But this is also true, it's universal in that sense. And so people, Latinos, women, other groups? How do you have that internal conversation so that one can then step aside and have the external conversation? And that will be the second part of tomorrow's discussion. I've been privileged to be engaged with a series of, how shall I call them, free and frank exchanges with the Federal Communications Commission, which is about to take some very momentous steps over the next months or so that will have a big impact on diversity in the American media. And so I'm going to report a little bit on how a group of 30 of us got together, working with people at the FCC, to try to get them to change their definition of the relationship between monopoly competition and diversity. So that's sort of where this is going to go. I do just want to do one thing that I said this also yesterday, is that this is both a professional pleasure to be here and also a personal pleasure. It's a personal pleasure because of the things that we've been talking about, like the creation of the center. I said yesterday, thank God we didn't burn this place down and the mem hall, which was on the table, I think, Lee, we had talked about that. I didn't mean to bust you, Lee, on that. But we came to our senses and didn't burn that. We just sort of tried to create institutions. So that's a great pleasure. But I also, in the process of putting all this together, I knew that my grandfather had graduated in the class of 1910 from here. And I knew he knew Du Bois a little bit. What I didn't know until I did the research is this thing, if it works. There we go. So there were the series of conferences, the Armenia conferences that were held in 1916 and 1933, convened by W.B. Du Bois, who was class of 1895, got his PhD from that during that year. And so this is a picture. Now, it's very interesting. Being an old guy as I am, I said, well, I want to get a picture of my grandfather. So, but I'll have to wait till I go to Washington, and I'll go to the Moreland Spingarn collection, and I'll talk to Howard Dodson. Maybe he'll let me in the stacks, maybe he won't. And I said, well, I know what I'll do. I'll go online. And sure enough, I went online, and so this is a picture. See if I can do this right. Which one has Du Bois in it? I think it's this one, the one at the top. The fellow who is sort of leaning forward in the front there with the mustache is my grandfather, and Du Bois is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 people in the first row standing on the left. So it was a delight to discover that and some other things that I won't bore you with that have to do with my family's relationship with W.B. Du Bois, which I really did not know until I was invited by Skip and his colleagues to come do this. So it really was, for me, a kind of awakening to the relationship between the personal and the intellectual and the professional. And a lot of his... Is that why you look like him? Well, there was that. I said yesterday, right, well, we could do that. Don't play that. Now, don't do the dozens. Don't do the dozens. But Mrs. Du Bois did once say, oh, you look just like W.B. And I said, my goodness, that's an honor, except maybe I look like W.B. when he was 90 rather than... But there are all these weird connections, and part of it is the notion of building a community, an intellectual community, a community that's based not only in race, but in values and commitments. And that's something that we saw in that picture. And one of the things I'm going to recommend at the end of this talk and tomorrow, that maybe we need to convene another Armenia conference to talk about these issues, the intersection of race and media and communication. Because if you think back to when Du Bois wrote, he wrote at the beginning, or sort of the middle beginning of a transition from an industrial to a post-industrial, from an agricultural into an industrial society. That was the milieu, that was the background against which he wrote. Well, we're doing the same thing now. We're going from an industrial society to a post-industrial society, from an industrial society to a communications, media, knowledge-based society. And that's hugely, hugely important, and it has not received the attention that I think it is due. I will also point out, as I did yesterday, that it was a real thrill. This shows you how academics think. So I knew I was going to give this talk about the relationship between race and technology. And I thought it was really, really nice of the entire presidential campaign to boil down to two basic issues. One, did the minorities turn out? Yes. B, why did they turn out? Because of this new technology, new communication technology that had been used by the Obama campaign. Data mining, targeting potential demographics. It is probably the case that Obama would not be president today if his team had not used that technology. And that technology also mobilized those folks to get out to vote, his base constituency. And so I think that if we take that as a kind of metaphor for the future, then we're going to see the intersection of media and communications technology on the one hand and diversity on the other coming together in ways that will surprise all of us and may be one of the most important things that happened, I believe, in the evolution of American society. And I'm going to give you the punchline very quickly. I was talking with Lee Daniels on the way over. Where I'm going to go with this is that communications and media is coming to the center of American political economy. It's becoming more important. At the same time that it is becoming more important economically, for our GDP, for our exports. We don't export cars and cowbellies anymore. What do we export that brings in so much money? Content. The most valuable company in the United States of America is Apple. It's not General Motors. So this is an issue that's becoming hugely important. It's hugely important for democracy with challenges to the American press. The issue is becoming more and more important. It is becoming more central to our modern lives. And when you look at the statistics, which I had the misfortune of doing recently, if you look at journalism, television, movies, the printed press, etc., we find that the number of African Americans and other people of color who are in positions of senior leadership, if you look at ownership, and if you look at the content of what is produced on those platforms, they are either stagnant or declining. Importance goes like this, African American participation going like this. How do we explain that? And as importantly, and this is something that Du Bois would say, how do we fix that? How do we understand that scissoring that we're seeing, and how do we fix that? Well, so what would Du Bois say if he were around today? What would Du Bois say? And I'm going to suggest a couple of things, but I do want to just point out, and I would urge you to visit the site when you have an opportunity, because I posed that question using our new technologies to a number of folks who I thought might have interesting responses. It included Ben Jealous, the president of the NAACP, former Federal Communications Commission Chair Michael Copps, Lee Daniels, who is Director of Communications with NAACP Legal Defense Fund, who is here today, the editor of the LA Times, John Slaughter, Adam Powell, et cetera, et cetera. So they provided some very interesting answers to this question, and I would urge you to visit the site. Now, being Martin Kilson's student in part, and getting older and cranky, I'm going to say that there are several flaws in W.B. Du Bois's work. There are flaws in his work. One of them is that Du Bois was not a great synthesizer, and by the way, my wife and I, she may not speak to me on the flight back because we disagree on this issue. He was clearly a prodigious scholar who wrote in multiple forms, essays, poetry, sociological tracts, big historical books. But I would argue he did not systematize his work in the way that other scholars have systematized their work in terms of providing an overall intellectual framework that would guide subsequent writing. Now, if I ask some of you in the room, do you know any Marxists? I won't try to out anybody here and ask them if they're Marxists. I used to be in the day. Okay, so that people do fess up. We know what a Marxist is. If I say, please raise your hand if you're a Weberian. I studied with Reinhard Bendix, and I do know what a Weberian is. I can recognize that. Freud. But what's a Du Boisian? What is a Du Boisian? If I said, please raise your hand if you're a Du Boisian, some of you would probably raise your hand, at which point I would say, well, what the hell do you mean by a Du Boisian? What is a Du Boisian? I don't know for sure what a Du Boisian is. Now, of course, he was writing in a time before the sort of Big Bang blew up social sciences. So there was history and a little bit of sociology. He, of course, studied with Max Weber. Today, we're confronted with a different set of epistemological challenges of interdisciplinarity, trying to figure out how economics and political science and public policy fit together. And I will say that I don't think that Du Bois provides a lot of guidance for that, because he just wrote everything, studied everything at every level of analysis across the world, and did not feel the imperative to pull together a synthetic, comprehensive whole. But I hope I will have provoked some thought on that, and we can talk about it. By the way, if there's a question of fact or lack of clarity, please interrupt as I go along. If there are these sort of big issues that really need to be wrestled with, then I would prefer to take questions at the end. But having said he didn't systematize it, let me try to do a little bit of that myself. And so I think if Du Bois were here and he were asked, what is the impact of the information revolution and all that suggests on African Americans, he wouldn't give the answer to that question first. He would give the meta answer. The meta answer would be, if you want to answer that question, here is the way that you organize your thinking to organize and answer that question. So I think he would do the following 5 things. He would say, if you're going to answer that question, then your answer should be based on sound empirical evidence. Don't make it up, do the research. Secondly, it would require rethinking and perhaps rewriting of conceived, conceptual, and theoretical categories, as he did in much of his own writing. Thirdly, matters of exclusion, oppression, and discrimination, especially by race, should be at the center of the analysis and not something that's tacked on. As I said yesterday, if we go and look at the great texts that have been produced in the field of communication, sociology, about the transition to a post-industrial society, about the movement to a communication society, and you look in the index under race, or African Americans, or Latinos, you don't find a lot. You don't find a lot there, which I think is ridiculous. Fourthly, I think Du Bois would answer by saying, however you answer that question, it should lead to purposeful and progressive action. In other words, theory is good, scholarship is good, but at a certain moment in his life, so the middle period of his life and the early to middle period, he was very much a man of action. He was engaged. And so what I want to do today is to provide really just some examples for us to talk about, because as you know, the core of the new technology is that it's interactive. And the idea of the sage on the stage rather than the guide on the side is something that we should take seriously. And so I really do want to leave some time today for discussion, because I really would value your insights and expertise. So what I'm going to do is sort of rattle off some interesting examples, not quite case studies, but some interesting examples that will help us understand the scissoring. More and more important in society, fewer and fewer African Americans, or a smaller and smaller percentage of African Americans participating. I'll give you one statistic. The FCC released last week the number of African American owned properties, broadcast properties, in 2009. Now, you know, we're what, 12%, 13% of the population? In 2009, the percentage of properties owned by African Americans was 1%. since 2009, it has dropped to 0.7%. What's that about? Well, I think it has something to do not with technology, not with Twitter, not with blogging. It has to do with power. It has to do with economic power. It has to do with political power exercised in a variety of institutions across our country and increasingly around the world. So that's what I hope to be able to do, is just illustrate a few of these moments where power was exercised. And I hope we can draw lessons from that, because most of the examples will be in the legacy media, not so much in the new media. Partially not so, and we had a really interesting discussion last night about the origins of some of the online African-American themed sites. I discovered, I didn't know, Skip, that you had been involved with Africana.com, and then that turned into the Black Voices. But this is really, really new. And even the descriptions, if you Google this stuff and look for it in the press, it's hardly there. But we need to capture this analytically as social scientists, as scholars, to find out whether the lessons that we learned from the old style of thinking about media and ownership and management will carry into the new. So I'm going to start in 1996 with something called the 1966 Telecommunications Act. So I see some of you nodding. You know about that. If there was one single thing that cleared the way for the Communication Society to come in, it was this Telecommunications Act. In fact, it was so important to the people involved that they spent more lobbying money on that one bill in 1996 than in any other bill in the history of the United States of America. Even after the bill was passed, between 97 and about 2006, the top 7 companies and their trade associations spent another $400 million to try to block the implementation of aspects of the bill they didn't like. So we're talking a big deal here. Quick parenthesis. I do want to just throw up something on the board. I'll say what I said yesterday about technology. Power corrupts, PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So I find this interactive approach, there we go, a little better. So the theory that I'm going to talk to you about is called communication at the center. Communication at the center. The purpose of the theory is to prevent the problem that we all have when we try to understand this stuff. It's like drinking water from a fire hose. You've heard all of that metaphor before. Drinking water, trying to take a sip of water from a fire hose. And I think we need a conceptual framework. I won't call it a theory. I'll call it a conceptual framework that can organize our thinking. So the idea here is pretty straightforward, is that stuff involving technologically mediated communication has always been pretty important. I mean, communication's always been important. That's what makes us human. But at a certain moment in time, these communication technologies were rather more peripheral to society. And what we're seeing today is communication moving more and more to the center of our lives. As individuals, young people spend 7.5 hours a day through mediated communication. So that's point number one. This is a major transition from industrial to post-industrial, and one way to think about it is through this framing. And that occurs at 3 different levels of abstraction. One, at the macro level, so communication is becoming more central to the GDP, the gross domestic product. It's more economically important. Secondly, it's also more important at the middle level of organizations. Organizations used to be real vertical. Now they're flattening out. The communication function in organizations used to be PR, and now it is maintained in the C-suite, CEO, COO, etc. Thirdly, communication is coming to the center of our individual lives. I want to ask how many of you have 2 or 3 different devices on you right now. Right now. In fact, anyway, pay attention to the lecture, not just do this, you know. So the point I'm trying to make is if we're going to understand this transition from the old to the new, then we need to understand it as communication becoming more central to our lives, occurring at 3 different levels of abstraction: the macro level, the organizational level, and the individual level. And these cases will illustrate this process. The 1996 Act. I'm going to talk about the minority tax certificate. You've probably heard about Comcast. You know the pretty sweet Comcast deal? Comcast is the largest distributor of cable distributor in the country. They just bought NBC Universal. And the deal was, you can buy that, but you have to set aside 10 minority channels. So the question is, who got the channels? How'd they get the channels? What are they producing on the channels? Et cetera, as another example of this process. And I'll say a little bit about the origins of Black Planet and Net Noir. The final piece of this is that this doesn't happen automatically. And here I disagree with some of my colleagues who believe that the technology is determinative rather than power. So I think that what happens when these things occur is a process of strategic restructuring where interest groups say, a new technology. I would like to own that new technology. I would like to control that new technology. I would like to write the rules of the game that determines how markets will allocate that technology. Now, that's a very different starting point than saying, if those minority kids would just get more of these. And that's not too much of an exaggeration. If you look carefully at some of the op-eds, if you look at some of the professional magazines, if we could just get more of these into the ghetto, and by these I mean, sort of iPads and so forth, then all shall be revealed and equality will run rampant, like a mighty river, somebody once said. The problem is if you look at the empirical evidence, this is where Du Bois comes in, the more of these that you all have used, guess what's happened? Inequality has grown dramatically in the United States of America. Not just African American white inequality, but within the entire population of ownership, or wealth, or income. I mean, the folks out in Silicon Valley are doing extremely well. The folks in Roxbury are maybe not doing as well. So I don't want to make I'm not making a causal argument. I'm not saying if you add a cup of this into societies, they become more unequal. I'm not saying that. But what I am saying is empirically it is the case that over the past 10 years, as more people have used these technologies, inequality has also increased. So we just have to unpack that. We have to figure that out, and I think that one way to do so is to insist that it is about power. It's not about the technology. The technology doesn't drive this stuff. It's power relationships. It's social relationships. It's command over other resources like capital, like political power, like land, like technology, et cetera. So when I talk about these cases, I'm suggesting to you that strategic restructuring, which I can define a bit later, made these things happen. And as we move into the future, and more of us become more digital, and more properties are owned by large corporations or small startups, then the rules of the game governing that process will also be a matter of power, 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 not just technology, technology, technology. So I'm really just going to rattle off these things here. 1996. Some of this is a research agenda. That's part of really what I'm suggesting. 1996, I'll start with the individual, okay? 1996, a guy named Al Gore was Vice President of the United States. And he had been a kind of a geeky guy in Congress and thought about the internet and so forth. He said, you know, this internet thing is pretty cool, but these really big telephone companies and others are excluding new startups to get into the industry. And that's not a good thing. And so we really need to completely restructure the telecommunications sector. Really stupid idea. How can that possibly happen? The most powerful companies, AT&T, how could that possibly happen? Well, he had a crazy idea, and I hope by the end of this session we'll have some crazy ideas too that will come out of our discussions. But he had been elected Vice President of the United States, and he cut a deal with the President. He said, Mr. President, I would like to have the telecommunications media portfolio. And Bill Clinton said, okay, you got it. He assembled a team of other individuals. Greg Simon, who was a friend of his, he hired a man named Reed Hunt, who said that he became chairman of the Federal Communications Commission because he had the brilliance when he was a young man to sit behind the future vice president of the United States when he was in high school in Washington and sit in law school behind the future president of the United States. And so he got an appointment to be chairman of the Federal Communications Commission. Very smart guy. This is not to take away anything from Reed, who was a good friend. Greg Simon, a guy named Larry Irving. Larry Irving had worked for Mickey Leland, African-American congressman, had worked on the Senate Telecommunications Committee. So my point is, there was a crew of people. There was a small group of conspirators who said, we are going to revise the American political economy at its heart. So that's at the individual level. What did they do at the organizational level? Al Gore seated those people, chairman of the Federal Communications Commission, in the White House. Larry Irving went to be Assistant Secretary for Commerce. Other people in other institutions. So individual, change, thinking about ideas, competencies, restructuring organizations in government to make it possible for these changes to happen. And then they went to work, and the result was the 1996 legislation. Cleared away a lot of the ground, reduced the power of the telecommunications industry, made it more possible for the Googles of the world to come forward. But it did some other things that had some impact on people of color. One, it changed the power of the Federal Communications Commission so that in the old days when the FCC, say if you came and you want to get a license for a TV station, you'd have to fill out all sorts of forms, and you would have to say what's the impact that your station is going to have on local communities. They switched to auctions. If you have a straight auction system, who wins? Who wins? Right, the highest bidder. If the FCC has more discretion, then the FCC can say, well, you know, they're serving Roxbury, or they're serving other parts of the country. So that was one thing that happened. Secondly, it permitted more concentration. It permitted more market concentration and of ownership. And so if the big guys get more resources and power in markets, who does that hurt? Smaller entrepreneurs, women-owned firms, firms owned by people of color. So these were some downsides. Now, they also promoted cheaper E-rates for schools. So if you're living in a rural area, then they kind of subsidize through a universal service fund. So that's a good thing. That was a good thing for people of color. But this is a theme that I want to come back to again and again and again. Over the past 15, 20 years or so, we've talked about the digital divide. Remember that? And we were militant about the digital divide, and the digital divide's got to go. Guess what happened? It went away. I said, damn, now what do we talk about? So the digital divide, the difference between black and white, rural, urban, as happens with most technologies, it shrank. It shrank over time. But I think we have another digital divide now, which is the ownership and management and content digital divide, which is much more difficult to address. Okay, so deregulation, huge lobbying efforts. I mean, this is, I have to defend, I guess, the NAACP here. 1997, 2008, 8 of the biggest media companies and 3 trade associations spent $400 million on political contributions to congressmen, basically. But that's probably a lot more money than the NAACP or the Urban League was able to mobilize on behalf of a more progressive, African-American oriented, people of color oriented program. Couple more in broadcasting. One is the minority tax certificate. I won't go into gory details, but this was launched in 1978 because a group of individuals, Bill Wright from Washington, D.C., that we used to hang out with way back in the day, and about 7 or 8 folks kept getting together and said, the absence of African-American owned stations is just killing us. We really need more African-American owned stations. They got together, they formed a cabal, they worked with Congressional Black Caucus. Eventually they got legislation passed that made it possible for owners of media assets, if they wanted to sell it, if they sold it to an African-American firm or a woman-owned firm or a Latina-owned firm, they got a tax benefit. Okay? Big company selling a property, they can sell it to an African-American. They get the same amount of money because they get a tax benefit, but then the buyer is buying it at a lower cost. Now, there's some interesting statistics. In 1978, before the minority tax certificate program, minority ownership of broadcast property stood at 40 out of 8,500. 40 out of 8,500. After the launch of this program, which was passed by Congress, all sorts of political horse trading, power was exercised. It rose, after the launch of the program, it rose to 288 radio stations alone, 43 TV stations, and 31 cable systems within 17 years. This is a program that worked. This is a program that really worked to increase diversity. And the point I want to make here also is that this is not diversity just for, numbers' sake. This is because a number of studies have suggested there's a relationship between ownership and management and content. Owners select employees, executives, who will address the markets that they want addressed, to sell to those markets. So this is not just ownership numbers for ownership numbers for ownership numbers. But if we're going to be a democratic country, if we're going to fully represent the perspectives and cultures of all of the citizens of the United States of America, then all the citizens of the United States of America need to have an opportunity to tell their story. And so that is what this tried to do. Well, what happened in 1994? Remember the Republican rebellion and Newt Gingrich? Do you remember what one of their major platforms was? Against affirmative action, down with affirmative action. Thank goodness they've come so far since that time. And so one of the first things they did is say, we're going to stop all these giveaways, not thinking about the giveaways that were given to the big companies. We're going to stop these giveaways, and we're going to rescind this thing. We're going to get the first thing, this is such a terrible thing. We're going to get rid of this preferential treatment. Well, I think I mentioned to you earlier that the African American ownership is down to 0.7%. Now, there are other reasons. It wasn't just the legislation. I'll talk about this, access to capital. It's whether or not the advertisers want to advertise, whether it's online or in the newspaper. But that's a point that I wanted to bring to bear here, is that small group of individuals form a group, help to pass legislation which advances through organizations, which helps to begin to restructure the media system in the United States. That worked between 78 and 95. Now, part of what happened during this period is that, remember the first act passed in '96. The elimination of these tax certificates was 1995. So both of those things happened roughly at the same time. So it was really a 1-2 punch. The right hand took away, and then the left hand took away too. So that substantially hurt the minority-owned broadcast industry, Hispanic, African American, Asian American, et cetera. The Comcast deal. Comcast is the largest cable company in the United States of America. The way that this communication at the center thing is operating, as most of you know, is that you want to be able to control the distribution system, and you want to be able to control the content that flows over that system. That way you control markets all up and down the value chain. So Comcast said, we'd like to buy NBC Universal. And then a lot of their opponents in the markets, a lot of politicians, people in Congressional Black Caucus, and others said, wait a minute, if you do that, that will create such a monopoly of control and content that it will be very difficult to have minority voices heard on your stations. Because Comcast didn't have a great record in producing diverse content. So they went back and forth over a period of years. They went to the Federal Communications Commission. They went to the Department of Justice, which got involved. This was a multi-billion-dollar deal. And the way it was worked out, and again, a bunch of individuals working through organizations to affect the macro structure of the economy, the Federal Communications Commission and the Department of Justice said, okay, if you want this deal to go through, here's what you have to do. You have to hire more people of color. You have to create a $10 million, $20 million, $20 million, I think it was, investment fund to provide capital for small and medium-sized enterprises owned by women and people of color. And you have to set aside 10 channels to be purchased by African Americans, Asian Americans, and Hispanic. 10 channels. That's pretty substantial. So Comcast hemmed and hawed, but they said, you know, we really want to create one of the biggest media corporations in the world, and paying this little bit of money, I was not privy to their conversations. But I can imagine they said, a couple $100 million, it's a deal. Just get out of my way so I can start linking all this up. So Comcast has selected 4 companies, 2 Hispanic, one owned by a producer, a TV producer, Rodriguez in Texas, one owned by a children's programming company, and then one owned by a guy named Magic Johnson, and another one owned by that great filmmaker and television producer P. Diddy. So, as academics say when they're trying to duck the question, it will be an empirical question. It will be an empirical question whether or not P. Diddy and Magic Johnson are going to be able to create the kind of system that will do the kinds of things that I think most people in this room would want. Well, we want for them to have commercial success, right? Otherwise, it's not sustainable. And yet, at the same time, like any other channel, we hope that there is some content that is produced that will be valuable, that will be authentic, et cetera. Now, why do we say that? I'm going to read some figures in a moment about my new hood.
How much did they pay? You know?
Yeah, no, actually, it's bids were put in, and the bids right now, I think, have not been made public. But it was both the money, but it was also the ability to mobilize a production company. Because, I mean, you know, and I've talked to Magic Johnson, I've talked to his CEO about this. They have to buy studios. They have to buy the talent to run the studios. They have to get co-financing. They have to produce some kind of content. It's a big, huge investment. And Lord knows I wish them well. But again, it's another example of politics and strategic thinking being leveraged through the FCC and the Department of Justice and the private sector institutions to try to change the structural conditions of a particular market. Okay? And I'm going to very quickly just talk about Hollywood, my new neighborhood, which is really quite something. It's much nicer weather, by the way. Any of you thinking about working? Some of you students here, any student here. Mr. Burse, you're about Hollywood's pretty cool. It's nice and warm out there. Okay. Eric flew out with me to do what he's doing on the communication side. Okay. The bottom line is that if I rattled off these statistics, you'd be horrified. For writers, producers, directors, and actors, the numbers are not good. Between 2008, 2009, found that while the share of minorities working in television, 10%, rebounded to 2005 levels, the earnings gap between minorities and white writers more than doubled since 2007. So even if the numbers go up, the payment is not to the same extent. The minority share of employment in feature films declined to the lowest level in a decade, falling all the way from the high of 6% in 2007 to 5%. 5% of minority employment in feature films. The share of, I mean, it goes on and on and on for writers, producers, et cetera, et cetera. This is not a good thing. If we, what is it for writers? Let's see. I have it here someplace. Yeah. It's down. It's basically down. And there's an interesting piece. Down from a low point. Down from nothing. I mean, not nothing, but, you know, down from chump change. That's like up from slavery, down from nothing or something. I mean, that's like, you know, it looks like up to me. Right? The other thing, anybody remember Norman Lear? No, Norman Lear. Okay. So Norman Lear did All in the Family. Archie, he did the Jeffersons. He did Maude, Sanford and Son. Name drop. He and I have gotten to be very good friends. He's actually Mary Hartman. So what happened to that? I mean, that was what, late 70s? So how could it happen that there were shows like that 20, 30 years ago, 30, 40 years ago, that were raw, that were critical, that talked about race in these issues? And I really like LL Cool J. I mean, he's a good actor, you know, he's macho, he gets the bad guys, never gets many women on the show, but he gets the bad guys, he never walks in and says, you know, I had a driving while black incident today. You know, he never comes in and says, my son was called the N-word at school. But when I get together with my friends, my reality is that if it's 4 African American guys at dinner, which I do once a month, and they all make a lot more money than I do, we talk about what happened, what it means to be a black American male in a competitive, white-dominated society. I never see LL Cool J talk about that. I mean, he must have a great life, right? I want to do what he does. So these things matter. They matter to us. They matter to our children. What kind of message are we sending our children? And so content does matter. Now, I want to close by simply raising a couple of questions. And I have some data, and if we have time in the Q&A, I will play this back to you. But Black Planet, well, the big framing is the following. We've seen the exercise of political power, entrepreneurship, what we talked about yesterday, a number of factors, so that we go from here to here to here. What I do not know, and looking at the evidence, well, there's hardly any evidence on this, is the following. What has been the experience of black ownership and black management in the digital space? Now, there were sort of 2 or 3 foundational early entrants into this space. One was by David Ellington, who created something called Net Noir, and Omar Wasso, who is actually a student here, who founded Black Planet, new professor at print at that place down the road, and Africana.com. Right. We talked about that. So around the same time, at the same time that white folks were creating online properties, that was also true for African Americans. Now there's some interesting demographic, sociological differences between, from what I've been able to see in that group, but we can talk a bit about that. But the broader point I'm trying to figure out is where they get their capital from. One was co-funded by AOL. Another one was funded, Omar's firm, Black Planet, very interesting, was founded, he did a deal with some folks of Asian background who wanted to create an ethnic site. And so they had African American, they had Hispanic, and Asian. Very interesting strategy, which then AOL also followed by aggregating sites. It was more profitable. It attracted more eyeballs if you could have one site and then be clicked through to another site that was also ethnically based. And advertisers wanted that. I mean, if you said, look, I've got X number of folks who are clicking through, then your ad rates are going to be here. If you say, I'm going to draw Hispanic eyeballs and Asian eyeballs and African American eyeballs and 18 million people come and say, fine, I want to advertise with you. But what we don't know fully yet is what has been the sort of the trajectory, if you will, the career path, the success of these companies. They've all been pretty much merged so that they're now owned by Huffington Post, the Washington Post, and a little company called NBC. So the interesting intellectual question, I think, which is also relevant for public policy, is in the old system, ownership and management and content were closely linked, right? I mean, the empirical studies show that. We do not know if that same relationship exists online. Does it make a difference that NBC owns a black-themed property and it's not owned by someone who, let's say, might be a radical black capitalist nationalist? Stranger things have happened. I mean, we don't know. And it's an empirical question. And there are competing theories about that. And I hope that as we think about what our role is as scholars, that this is the kind of research that we can do. That this is the kind of research that we can do. I think this is what W.E.B. Du Bois would have, this is the kind of research agenda he would have proposed. What's the role of ownership? What's the role of power? What's the role of race in the transition from an industrial society to a post-industrial communications media society? It's hugely important. It's hugely important. It's hugely important. One of the things that those of you in this room can do, here's a question for you. Are we training young people of color and women to understand this? Are they getting this in their classroom? Are they being encouraged to be entrepreneurial and innovative and rewarded for taking risks even if they fail? Or are they being told something else? It's good to tweet as much as possible, or run up and down a basketball court or a football field. So I would like to throw out a challenge to my colleagues here in Afro-American studies. I did a little Googling. I could not find much in Afro-American studies that talked about this stuff, which I think is a failing, and it's something that W.E.B. Du Bois would not accept. But I also looked at the field of communication, which is my new home. we're not doing a great job of teaching this either. We're teaching theories about theories about theories that I think 9 people read, if that, and 8 of them are graduate students who have been assigned to read this by their professor. Get 9 citations. So this is an issue that's much too important to be left to economists, policy analysts, etc. And what 2 better fields to address this than African American studies, which we've heard is relatively new. We don't have a lot of encrusted, issues of, what is the canon? And, I mean, we do, but probably not as much as some of the older fields. And what better field than communication to get involved with this, because this is our natural domain. So, ladies and gentlemen, as we go forth as scholars and as practitioners, I hope that we will remain intellectually engaged and also politically engaged and invent a new future. Someone once said that the future is already here, it's just not evenly distributed. So I want us to invent a future. If there is a future out there someplace down toward MIT or Palo Alto, we need to find that future, get involved in that future, and start to redefine it radically so that the concerns of people of color and women are at the center of our new society and not remaining at the periphery. Thank you very much. Doctor.
Can you activate it? Yes, there we go. Great. Just like yesterday, fantastic today. I would encourage you to consider one more factor, though. When you Googled African American studies, secondary literature, and you found rightly that this is not ownership, particularly in the new media, if we can still call it that.
Right.
Has not been a particular concern yet, but the fact that of the black startups that you mentioned, Africana.com, Net Noir, and Black Planet, 2 out of 3 were by Harvard people. So for once, we weren't theorizing about it, we did it. And one of us did it twice.
That's true.
Right? And in fact, when I started the route, I got Omar Wasso, to start it with me.
Right.
So that you got to give us the credit for that.
No, I do. As a Harvard man, I tip my hat.
Because it was more important to create the company than to write about it, right? But what we need is more academics thinking entrepreneurial.
Right. And we also, and this is just in terms of the crude stuff that, I won't say the basic stuff that professors do. We teach, most of us. We teach and we write. That's what we do. There's a relatively small handful, I've discovered, that likes to do the stuff at the interstices of practice. I mean, we sort of all talk about Du Bois as, being a scholar, a profound scholar, and also a man of action. Most professors don't want to do that. They just, it's not what we, putting on my professor hat, it's not what we do.
No, and Du Bois, though it's a shock to people, but if you think about it, he was a great entrepreneur. He never made any money, but he understood. As you said yesterday, he started at least 3 magazines.
Right, exactly.
And he was starting organizations all the time.
Absolutely.
Every time he got kicked out of one, he started.
Right.
another.
And since he lived to be 93, he was a lot of organization. But the point I want to make is that I assume if people are, in fact, to be frank, I was a little nervous about these talks, other than the fact that I had to write them and figure out what I was going to say. I didn't know who the audience was going to be. Because
It's going to be black nationalists from 1970 who are going to.
well, I see a couple of them in the room, so I do know.
Yeah, but they're all sold out.
Right. Oh, no. They're still doing good work.
They got haircuts.
They're still doing good work. But part of the dilemma is the sort of the epistemic communities that do IT and communication stuff tend not to do racial stuff. That's just, Colin, my buddy, he and I talk about this all the time. director of the Berkman Center here on campus. And the folks who do African American stuff tend not to do the IT cyber stuff. So we've got these two communities. And thank God all of you are in this room. I was afraid there'd be like 4 people. But it's a great thing, and I think what we have to do, those of us who do the cyber stuff and those who do the inequality, diversity stuff.
But tell them
Need to
about.
work.
But tell them about your own role, the journal that you started at MIT. When was that?
Right. That was
'cause
6
Anthony and
or
I had come here.
Right. That was like 7 or 8 years ago. But again, as we talked about yesterday, we have to reproduce ourselves.
But tell them what the journal was.
Well, the journal is called Information Technology and International Development. And it grew from my frustration and Mike Best, who was down at MIT. You know Mike well.
Because of you.
And great guy, PhD from the Media Lab. And we got frustrated mostly because, or 2 things. One is that in the traditional journals, it was mostly talking about those on the top and on the inside. They didn't talk about developing countries and IT. They didn't talk about Africa. They didn't talk about Asia, especially from that perspective. It was mostly about OECD countries, et cetera, et cetera. We also got annoyed because the computer people weren't talking to the social scientists or the humanists, but it was completely divided. So we said, crazy idea. We're going to create a journal that lets everybody talk to everybody, gets these epistemic communities together, and it will be peer reviewed, and it has to be passed on by not just an engineer or a social scientist or a humanist, but together. But it's like you have to be a little weird to do this stuff. Let's just face it. You got to be a little odd to work in this space. But I think that's the future of the world. So.
We have a lot of questions.
Yes.
We'll start here on the sofa.
Oh, thank you. Just quickly, we'll walk our way around. The idea, I'm a consumer of all of this media, right? And then the idea that producing, the fact that African Americans would own, produce authentically, quote unquote, African American content for an authentically African American audience. I mean, there's kind of slippage there. And as a consumer, I'm not interested. I'm interested in much more than quote unquote African American content. And what does all of that mean? So to have someone who's providing this information or the content solely pigeonholed into this African American is limiting. It's naturally limiting. It's never going to go beyond a certain. So obviously we have to, and I know you've thought about, we've all thought, thinking about these things in a broader context, not just African Americans and Hispanic Americans, to provide that content, because what does that really mean? When you really get down to it. So there's no answer to that, but it strikes me as something that we need to talk about.
Right. What I would just toss out to you is the black scholar, black world experience that many people of our generation had. Remember the class versus race debate.
These kids don't know what you're talking
I know,
about,
but
so
that's okay.
Black Scholar, Black World.
Black Scholar, Black World were 2 journals printed on paper that
What's that?
that talked about, it was a current events,
And they were current
and some of them you could be charged with current offenses, but it was a space. It was like Dissent magazine or New Republic.
for the New York Intellectual.
Right. Not Atlantic, that was a little more mainstream, but I'm thinking of things on the left or on the right that were much more politically engaged. One of the things I want us to talk about tomorrow is, does the root, the griot, and black voice replace that, augment that, detract from it? I was thinking, not a couple of weeks ago, I said, what happened to those words? They were so powerful. They were so important. All my friends read them. I'm trying to find the circulation figures.
Oh, that'd be easy from Ebony.
But I suspect it isn't. I mean, I thought everybody read it.
Oh, right.
But of course, everybody didn't read it because everybody wasn't getting their PhD from.
No, but it was 100 of us read it.
Right. And we each read it 5 times.
But what
Absolutely.
Because it got too radical.
Right.
And he said, now y'all out of control when we shutting this down. He did, just called the man in and shut it down in his face.
I remember that.
Yeah, so one of the reasons why I wanted to come today is because of the title, Policy Responses to Digital Inequality Beyond Economics. So my question relates to that, even though you didn't really address that issue in your remarks. So I'm going to put the question to you. Can the digital inequality be addressed by public policy? And if so, what would a comprehensive public policy agenda include?
Okay. I have two answers. One is that, and we talked a little bit about this yesterday, I think I'm pretty serious about a new Amenia conference. Based on the discussion that we've just had over the past 2 days. I think the time, and I'll be happy to lounge out like my grandfather did. We could have it at, anyway, wherever we have it. These are such important questions. Let me start off with the outcome would be a set of regulations being issued by the Federal Communications Commission that would make it advantageous. There would be positive incentives for investors and others to support minority-owned properties. Secondly, it would be legislation that would pass that would authorize the Federal Communications Commission to take those steps. Thirdly, it would be meeting with the Bob Igers of the world, this is the CEO of Disney, and others, to convince them, through whatever means necessary, to convince them that that this is good for business. Because the argument again and again and again is that we would love to hire more colored people, but they don't sell. And that, I think, is an empirical question. At the front end of that bill, there is work, as I mentioned yesterday, that we are doing with the Federal Communications Commission to provide an alternative analytic framework that they can use to evaluate communities that would allow them to reach more sophisticated regulatory conclusions. Right now, it's basically economics. There are other ways called ecology models that I know you know about, where you don't look at just one property, you look at all of the properties in the ecology, online, newspapers, and to start with the information needs of communities. I think it's a big part of the story. Because the country has become, there are more immigrants living in the United States. There's greater economic diversity in the United States. It is unclear that the information needs of those communities are being adequately met, especially at a time when journalism, newspapers, are closing down. So I think that there is a way to address that. And I'll say a little bit about, that's going to be one of the big case studies for tomorrow, is to describe how that process of bringing together 30 scholars from around the country.
Evelyn.
Right. So I just wanted to reassure you that African and African American Studies is doing something digitally. So we have an initiative that we started in 2006 called Social Engagement, and our students do a variety of entrepreneurial things, but and that are linked with academic work. But one of the things that we just recently have done, and we are still doing, we got a Harvard Innovation Grant to develop something called Social Portraits in Multimedia. And that will be a project that we have going in 3 classes. We are building electronic archives that will be shared with people in Africa and also in Latin America. So we've done that. We also have
What's the name of the guy?
Social Portraits in Multimedia.
Social Portraits in Multimedia.
I'll talk to you more about it later over dinner. And then we also had we've had students who've written social engagement theses, but we had last year 2 students to do dissertations, one in Goma, no less, and she's now teaching at UNC Chapel Hill, but another who might be here, Carla, are you here, Carla Martin, who did her dissertation, and a brilliant dissertation, but what she did for the social engagement part of it was to launch a website, which is a resource for Cape Verdean people across the globe. And she offers them all kinds of music and written sources, and if she's here, I hope she talks about this. Oh, okay. But it's just absolutely amazing. She has become famous in all these places in Portugal, and because of this. And finally, and I'm going to pass this to Suzanne, but just to make sure she talks about this, Suzanne has been very responsible and a leader in something called Africa Map, which is also an amazing digital platform about Africa.
Great, and I have there's also a project, or a couple projects at the business school involving, Africans are so far ahead of the curve in many places in the development of software that they've been working on, but thank you for that, and just a bit on statistics, and then actually a hard question for you. It's now grown into World Map. I'm looking at the site now, 270,000 unique visitors from every country in the world, 1,000 unique visitors per day. And this is a platform that's used from political issues addressing poverty and other questions in the state of Massachusetts, to medical issues, to history, urban planning, et cetera. And it's open to everybody. And funded initially through the provost and by Skip and by Evelyn and the Committee of African Studies. So this grew here as a model for Africa and was seen to be so salient that it was taken up in another array of arenas. Right. But my real concern is with the independence to a large degree of the internet, and concerns whether it's the aftermath of Sandy in New York City, where cell phones were, service was not available, or the aftermath. We've actually been able to, in World Map, to harvest Twitter and to frame it through different kinds of linguistic coding. So the potentials are really quite huge for this. But in the aftermath of the Arab Spring, among other things, to what extent are political systems going to become nervous about the huge potential for democratizing, whether it's economic issues or political issues, and that was certainly framed in part through the last election. Right. And I think that is one of the concerns, whether it's through huge costs that are going to come for accessing the internet, or the potential changes in terms of the quality of that access, or whether it has to do with one form or another of various types of censorship that could really become problematic or more problematic.
That's a really, really great question. It's a great way to frame it. Frankly, I sort of stayed away from content issues in this lecture series because I wanted to emphasize these other 3 factors of ownership, management, and control. And I recognize I did 2 things. One is as an internationalist, I'm sort of embarrassed to say this because most of my work has been on Africa and China and Brazil. But in I had to sort of hive off the international piece. The other thing I did not look at is exactly the question, although it's in the written manuscript, is the question of political power as being expanded or contracted because of the internet. And so in terms of my little model, the question would be running throughout here, what role do these new platforms play in amplifying power or diminishing power so that it becomes a kind of space where individuals can talk to one another about Mubarak, for example, or about Occupy, and then translate that into organizations of change, which in turn leads to hopefully more humane, more democratic outcomes. But the point is very well taken, and I would hope that at our Armenia conference on race, politics, and the internet, that these are the kind of things we can talk about, the intersection of power. And there's this, this wonderful series, I'm sure you've seen it, Access Denied, Access Palfrey, and yeah. So this is a really important line of work. I just didn't talk about it in this presentation.
Fred?
Just three quick comments related to what you were talking about. Why don't more African Americans get involved in ownership, the issue of entrepreneurship, and even risk? My first job, well, let me just first say this. In my own family, I was the first to graduate from college. When I came home from college, family fully supportive of me going to college a whole bit. Mm-hmm. I came home, my father, retired Sing Sing prison guard, says to me, okay, so what are you going to do now? Are you going to go get a trade? I mean, that's about as far as he could think. And this is not a condemnation of him, but that's as far. For his generation, it was quickly get to safety, that your family is economically safe and you can make a living. So that's part of the risk, that we got to change how we think as family and how we train people. My first job at a graduate school, by the way, I'm a Syracuse grad and Maxwell, school, Newhouse School, the whole thing. So I very much related to what you're talking about. As a TA in African American Studies, our best students, without a doubt, were Newhouse students. But when I first got out of school, I taught at Morehouse. And I'll never forget the first kind of open forum for the students and for the faculty was a statement that just rang and stayed with me forever. And our provost said that we are here to train you to be employers and not employees. That's a huge paradigm shift from the way most of us think. Right. And until that happens, a lot of what you're talking about is not going to change. And then thirdly, from the academic point of view, I'm a social scientist. Now, my wife is a Stern Business School grad, so we ended up, and I came as a spousal hire to Babson College, the #1 entrepreneurial program in the country for about the last 15 years. Right. So I understand exactly what you're talking about. But I can tell you that as a social scientist, most social scientists that come out of this Marxist orientation, they look at anything that's profit-oriented as the devil incarnate. And so until we change that paradigm, African-American studies, historians, other social scientists, we're not going to be able to change the way students think about this because we don't revere and we don't embrace the importance of business and entrepreneurship.
Point well taken.
But how many Marxists are left other than BJ? I mean.
There's this romantic, view of Marxism that looks at anybody. For example, if you have a book that actually is selling, other than an academic university's libraries, you must be some kind of prostitute. That's how.
Not in our department.
Yeah. But I think one way to think about that is that universities perform at least two functions. One is to preserve the past and to carry on traditions that go back 2,000 years. It seems to me that university, and so that's conservative. I mean, it's backward looking and it's important. Teaching reading, writing, arithmetic, logic, all that, rhetoric, all that stuff. But universities are also sites of permitted innovation. That you can do weird stuff inside on college campuses that you can't do in most companies, that you can't do in many other institutions in society. So I think that what we're trying to do at the Annenberg School, and I've seen it also at other universities, is to try to create these little nodes of bad behavior, of experimentation, of no grades, of permission to fail. And I find if you sort of hive this off in a little space in the corner and build it slowly under the radar, then the people in the economics department and the policy department won't, and the provost won't smash you. And that on the contrary, again, like Berkman or other things we're trying to do with this innovation laboratory, the people who think like that will show up at your doorstep. And so I think that's kind of a model sort of academic entrepreneurship, but just providing safe spaces for, experimentation.
Fox, then Lee.
My question is about the role of STEM learning, and also I've been working advocating this STEM to STEAM kind of idea, incorporating arts also into STEM education, of course. But the question is the role of say computational literacy, because we talk about innovation, and so and in training innovators in this area, what's your view on the role of computational literacy, so understanding procedural thinking, algorithmic thinking, to be able to innovate some of the new technologies, and how it relates to the kind of pedagogy related to these macro structures of organizational control, and how do they intersect within your own lab? How do you bring together these areas of computational literacy and pedagogy with the kind of literacy and pedagogy at this organizational and policy level?
That's a great question. And I mean, take the issue of big data, just as one. Most educators that I know who are in my position, who are deans or who have to make budgetary decisions, we know that big data is an important topic. And so I've been talking with my engineering department about whether we want to hire someone who jointly between the communications school and the engineering department. And I think it happens at two levels. Number one is, in the same way that we are literate or numerate in sort of older ways of thinking, we have to become literate and numerate in terms of algorithms and computer programs and the like. So I would say in the same way that we need to know about Shakespeare, we need to know about Cicero, we need to know about others in the ancient world to be literate. We're going to have to build into those programs for everybody a basic media literacy or computer literacy, just, numeracy and literacy for dummies. 101. Poets need to know this. Pre-med needs to know this. Social scientists need to know this.
That's been done.
Well, maybe at your school, but let me put another wrinkle on this. I want to produce the best students in the world who will help create the future. That's my goal. Some of them will have to be the best students in the world who know the relationship between social architecture in a society and social architecture within software as shaped by society. So there they have to be at the cutting edge. So I think it's a double problem. On the one hand, we need to create basic literacy for everybody, but then we also have to choose where we're going to place our bets in hiring high quality, imaginative, cutting edge folks who are unfortunately rather expensive, I've discovered. But we have to do both of those things. I think this is where both my field, communication, and Afro-American studies, we need to wrestle with that, because not everybody, I mean, you've got a background, you got an MFA, you got a PhD, you know all this computer stuff. You're part of the future. We need more people who have an appreciation for aesthetics and culture and context, and who can also write code.
We have time for just two more questions. Lee and Brandon.
Chico, your talk provoked my going back to something A.J. Liebling, who was celebrated press critic of the 1940s and 50s, said in many different ways, but the gist of it was freedom of the press is for those who own one, right? So if you're talking about the broad question of ownership, but if you connect it to the points you made about the dialogue, the internal dialogue and the external dialogue, and it was relatively simple to have a relatively simple internal-external dynamic at work, which is something that, to get really esoteric, existed on the undergraduate level here when there was agitation to start the department.
Right.
How do you do that now when you have that question out there of, if you own the press, you've got the freedom of the press. If you don't, you're at the mercy of those who own the press. And that goes for the blogosphere as well.
Right. The short answer, Lee, is I don't know. I mean, I'm trying to figure this out myself. The other thing that is a challenge is the following. When you and I either founded or recreated the Harvard Journal of Negro Affairs, as it was called then.
I have a complete first
Save that, it's going to be worth something someday.
already is.
That's good. It's a good thing. And let's face it, out-groups create the strongest in-groups. If you were persecuted and you were discriminated against, you need to be able to sit down with other people who are persecuted like you and discriminated against like you and just say, man, what are we going to do? These white folks are, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure Jews go through the same thing, and Lithuanian immigrants, and Lebanese when they're in Abu Dhabi. I mean, all human groups need to do that. And there is a feeling of comfort, protection, safety when we do that.
Yeah, but unlike Jewish people, unlike Asians, we're not creating our own Saturday schools. And that's what we've never done. We never have done. We can take Sunday schools and make them culture computer schools and entrepreneur schools, but we never do it.
Right. But see, the other side of that, which is also points to Lee's, the issue he raised, is that everybody's listening now. You know, when we wrote for Black
CIA
Scholar,
and
no, the CIA and FBI, they were always listening. I remember those days you'd pick up the telephone and you'd go like this, because we had the mythical belief that if you hit it twice, it would knock the FBI from, you know.
They didn't care about you little black kids.
Well, actually, if you do the request for, you know, the Freedom of Information stuff, but the point I want to make is that if you go on sites like The Root now, I mean, when we wrote our stuff, we could write our stuff, and we knew that, you know, not many people cared about it, except us. However, us is defined with a capital U. Now, when you post that stuff, and my friends, but you also get stuff that says like, nigger, we are going to lynch you, and you should go back to Africa.
Yeah, that's a nice one.
Right, and so, you know, I didn't see that very much in the Black Scholar, you know, or Black. So the point I want to make is that it's a kind of shift of consciousness, which, and frankly, as an old guy, I sort of miss that privacy. I miss that internal conversation. And I've talked to people in Hungary and Russia when they were oppressed and scared and needed to get together with samizdat. Well, there's a kind of value to that. I mean, this is sort of politically incorrect.
That ship has sailed.
No, I disagree. But even if it, I mean, we have to figure out what's the nature of the next dialogue. If it was at one time in the family, in the community, what does it mean to have both sympathetic listeners and stalkers?
But you got to just keep on writing and ignore all that stuff in the comments. I mean, you go crazy reading all that stuff. Brandon, you got to wrap us up. Bring us home so we can have food and drink.
Well, I want to thank you for this, the topic, because I think it is probably the most critical topic for people trying to think about inequality and political economy. And one of the questions I wanted to ask you is to go back to inequality. And you characterized it mostly in terms of inequality of ownership and inequality as a sort of way of thinking about exclusion and access from management and new media. But I was curious as to what you thought about broader social inequality and digital technology. So that there's a real concern among a lot of people that software is sort of eating the world, right? That there's going to be that there are so many revolutions in software that will eliminate lots of jobs, and that these jobs won't come back, and that while we may have new iterations of things like Airbnb destroys the hotel industry, for example, and people might rent out their apartments, but it's not the same type of labor regime that you once had. And that blacks are really, particularly low-income blacks, are going to be located at a place in the economy where, I mean, it's going to be the sort of William Julius Wilson story, but exacerbated to a level that we have probably never seen. And that's one way that people are sort of projecting outwards. And I was wondering what your take on that kind of claim about the way that digital technology is going to play out with broader social inequalities, particularly since its emergence has coincided with the rise of the most unprecedented inequality in American history.
And a footnote before you answer.
Yeah.
Answer is, are we presiding over our generation of African American intellectuals and members of the middle and upper middle classes, the permanent class divide in the African American?
Right. Again, I think that's a question that is really, really important, and ultimately, there are more people who are faced by that dilemma than are faced by some of these dilemmas. Or to put it another way, these are the sort of the elite brokers, politicians who are designing the rules of the game, and that's what I chose to focus on for this series. The broader question, one of the broader questions, is the one you just asked. What happens when the informatization of the economy displaces more and more and more and more jobs, either eliminating them entirely, like when you brought computers in, it sort of got rid of the middle of a lot of these organizations, or something else we haven't talked much about is globalization, when the jobs go overseas. And juxtapose that with the fact that there are 3 million jobs that are going unfilled right now. 3 million. What I didn't get a chance to talk about is some work that we're doing called Talent 21. What are the skill sets that CEOs, COOs, et cetera, are looking for in this kind of environment? But I think that is worth a lot more attention. I mean, I don't pay as much attention to the sort of to the employment labor issues that are associated with these new innovations. But when I do occasionally dip into it, it's a little scary for people of color. Because at least from agriculture to industry, brawn could carry you a long way. Now it will carry you nowhere. And you know, the dystopian version of all of this stuff is that if the United States of America does not figure out how to address your issue and the issue that we've been talking about here, then the inequality gap will grow so great that it will slow down the economic development for all Americans. It will generate social conflict that will remind us of other peaks and valleys in both race relations, but in class relations in the country. So I think when you add the piece that you just added, it underscores the fact that this is a really, really important issue, and none of us are giving it the attention it deserves.
Let's thank Ernie Wilson for Please join us for food and drink at the back of the room.
Thank you, good sir. Thank you,
Email
good